Welcome to the ACT podcast. I'm your host, Lizzie Harewood, and in today's episode, we embark on a journey exploring the delicate issue of pastoral care for transgender students through the lens of biblical teaching and professional boundaries. This episode takes on even greater significance as we acknowledge the disappointing news of the government's delayed guidance for schools after legal advice from the Attorney General. Well, welcome to the ACT podcast. In this series, we're going to be talking through some of the big issues that face the world of education today and asking how Christian teachers can respond with integrity to polarising topics. Now, it's no surprise that one of the topics that tops the bill when it comes to Christian teachers is the issue of gender identity. Last month, a top think tank, Civitas, revealed that 1 in 10 teenagers aged 16 to 18 want to change their gender or have already done so. The study found that 2/3 of teenagers were told biological sex is assigned at birth, while 1/3 believed women could have penises. Gillian Keegan, the Secretary of State for Education, said the government's upcoming transgender guidance for schools will recommend that schools inform parents if their child claims to be the opposite sex. And it's a live issue for many professionals, as we see highlighted in the media, those, particularly Christians, who've been penalised for misgendering or for raising concern about gender identity lessons. On today's episode, we want to get behind the debate and think from a more pastoral, personal perspective, as well as perhaps having the opportunity to discuss some of the bigger picture questions. Now, I'm fortunate to have our wonderful contributor, Andrew Bunt, here, who works for a charity called Living Out, as well as working in pastoral ministry for a church on the South Coast. Is that correct, Andrew?
That's right, sunny Southeast Coast.
Lovely. So, why don't you just briefly tell us about your work there and what your role is with Living Out?
Sure, yeah. So Living Out, we're a charity that exists to help people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality and also kind of adjacent topics such as gender and identity. So it's run by a group of us, all of whom are attracted to the same sex, so gay or same-sex attracted, how do you want to describe that experience, but who want to faithfully follow Jesus and believe that marriage is reserved for unions of one man and one woman. Thinking, how do we do that? But then how do we also do that biblical teaching in these adjacent topics of sexuality and gender as well? My particular role is as Emerging Generations Director. So I'm particularly helping us think, how do we help under 25s and those working with them to see the goodness of what God's word says on these topics and to kind of live them out. So we have a website full of resources, we do training events, all kinds of different things, our own podcast as well, through which we're trying to equip people, help people both see and experience the goodness of God's word.
So we'll hear a bit more about some of your story later, Andrew. But let's have a think about the kind of the basis of this issue. Now, at ACT, I get a lot of correspondence from teachers who are worried about this issue. And most teachers, which means Christian teachers too, will be at some point involved in teaching students who are experiencing questions about their gender identity. And often it becomes the topic of debates, competing rights, political discussions around changing rooms and public toilets. But I want us to think today about how we can keep the individual care of the student at the forefront of our minds as Christians, while still acknowledging the reality of the cultural context and the political context. So let's get straight to the heart of this. Andrew, what do you feel is behind the distress and confusion occurring with young people that means they're experiencing increased rates of issues around gender? And do you think the Bible has any explanation for this?
It's such a great question and such an important question to us to wrestle with, particularly because of the context of this, as any teacher who's been teaching for more than 5 or so years will know, is suddenly become a thing in a way it wasn't not that long ago. It's suddenly become kind of so prominent. So rightly, you want to ask, well, why is that happening? What's going on? Some people would just say that all that's happening is we become a much more kind of accepting culture, accepting world. And so actually trans people, people whose, as they describe it, gender identity internal to them doesn't match with their body, their biological sex, just have more freedom to be honest about who they're at. And people would say, well, it's just this younger generation are kind of the pioneers of being honest about that. The problem with that is it doesn't really account for the evidence we have. It doesn't really account for why we're seeing so many young people suddenly come out as trans, and we're not seeing in other age groups. It doesn't account for the fact that it's been predominantly teenage girls identifying as trans in the last 10 years, whereas prior to that, it's always been boys pre-puberty who've been questioning their gender identity. And we're not seeing really the same thing happening among women later in life at different ages. And it doesn't account for the fact that it's noticeable that this kind of cohort of young people identifying as trans, very clearly visible in kind of the referrals to the NHS Gender Identity Development Service, there's many characteristics of this cohort that don't match or don't kind of aren't proportional to the wider population. Much higher rates of mental health diagnoses, ASD diagnoses, or characteristics, traumatic experiences, questioning of their own sexuality, all these kind of things. And so I'm the view is an increasing number of people are that actually what seems to be happening is trans has become the available explanation for teenage distress of all kinds of sorts. And a young person hears this narrative and thinks, oh, that explains why I'm struggling in life. That explains why I'm feeling like I don't fit in. And then transition becomes the answer to it, in a sense. And so therefore, the question of where is this distress coming from? I think we've got to have that context in mind. I think it's a broad issue of teenage distress, not a gender specific thing. And so it becomes, why are teenagers distressed? Well, in a sense, we can all think back to teenage years and remember they are a bit distressing for most of us. And anyone who's a teacher who has the privilege of working with young people regularly will know teenage years are really hard, and childhood years, I think, is really hard. And I think actually it's only got harder since when I was there, say. I do think things like social media, we all know that's having some negative impacts, even if there are some positive impacts as well. I think online life and the online world is huge in this conversation, particularly because it is disconnecting young people from reality. So many of our young people are spending much of their life outside of school in an online world, which isn't reality. It's not embodied. And it's a world where you can kind of fashion yourself, which of course actually exactly what happens in the kind of trans narrative. So I think the internet is both increasing teenage distress and also increasing this sense of, well, I can fashion my own reality to solve that. I think the stress also linked to gender is being fueled by kind of sexualization and high pornography consumption and usage. Yeah. For a lot of people, a lot of young girls particularly, that becomes this stress about being a young woman, because that's how I'm going to be treated as a woman. I don't want to be a woman. And so I want to kind of flee from that. I think the same can be true of boys. This distress over, is that what men are like? I don't want to be a man. I'm going to kind of run away from this in a sense. Yeah. And you also asked her about kind of what's the Bible had to say to this. Well, the Bible can explain this, can't it? It can make sense of this. We live in a broken world. We live in a world where our hearts, until Christ acts in us, are turned away from God. And unsurprisingly, if we turn away from the good creator and his good plans, things kind of fall apart. And because God's good world has been damaged and marred by sin, there are all manner of experiences of distress that all of us experience in different ways throughout human life, which poses this question, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to trust our creator or trust ourselves as humanity? And I think the worrying thing for our young people is they're experiencing some of these painful realities that come from the fact we're living a good creation that's been marred by sin, and they're being encouraged to trust themselves and trust humanity rather than trust their creator. And I think sadly we're beginning to see kind of the futility of that and the way it's negatively impacting young people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a really interesting point you've made, Andrew, that amongst those young people or people that just, are in our kind of general society, there will be those that have a very deep-seated feeling of distress when it comes to their gender. But actually you're saying that perhaps, and I know this to be true from reflecting on my own teen years, distress is something that's common to many young people and is finding perhaps its avenue nowadays in the kind of the facet of identity in gender identity. I mean, I know I certainly had a particular identity when I was a teenager and at sixth form college, and the way I dressed would kind of represent this, and the music I listened to, and the way that I did my makeup and my hair, and the way that I kind of, tormented my parents with things that I wanted to do. And I'm not meaning to belittle the experience of gender distress at all, because actually the distress I went through as a teenager is probably one of the worst times of my life. I wonder, you've reflected a little bit in the book People Not Pronouns, which I had a really good read of, which is the kind of subtitle is Reflections on Transgender Experience. And I know that you say that your experience wasn't extensive, but you do have some reflections in here about your own experience of perhaps gender confusion. Is there anything that you can tell us that might represent the pain of those young people that are experiencing deep gender dysphoria?
Yeah, sure. That's so important, isn't it? Yeah, well, I mean, if I reflect on my own experience, I guess stories I've heard, my own experience, just to briefly summarize, was in kind of pre-puberty, a clear sense of feeling like I was a girl trapped in a boy's body. I really clearly remember reaching that kind of conclusion. I remember kind of deciding I had to never tell anyone, never get married, never leave my parents' homes, and everyone kind of found this out. That was kind of my childlike solution to the problem. And that went away as I went through my teenage years. And that's not an uncommon experience, actually. But I think that experience has really shaped my engagement with this topic now, my desire to engage with it and help Christians do so, because it has just helped me realize it really is possible to really have that very acute sense of, I am not who people think I am. I am not even who my body seems to say I am. I feel so strongly out of place and living in the world as, for me, it was a boy. I feel like actually I should be a girl. So one thing I was going to say about the experience of what gender dysphoria can be like is just that it can be very real. And sometimes we as Christians are being too quick to dismiss it actually and not notice that. Yeah. And what often happens, and I know that we'll talk about this more later, we get this difficult mixture because there's two very different things going on. There's genuine experiences that we want to acknowledge and in a sense legitimize and say, yeah, we believe you're experiencing this and we want to help you and love you on that. There's also a certain ideology, I think that's a fair word, which is an understanding of what this means, which we wouldn't agree with based on the biblical teaching, but also based on science and reason and evidence. And actually the problem is, because we want to oppose the ideology, we're at risk of brushing off the real experiences, but the experiences really are real. So I think the first thing to say is we're not at all, in a sense, opposed to experiences or saying experiences aren't real. We're just saying we have a different understanding of what they are and how we help. And so just that thing of gender dysphoria, gender questioning, the distress it causes can be very weird is just really important to say. Likewise, the fact it can be totally unchosen. That was my experience. I certainly didn't choose to be distressed in that way as a child. And trans-identified people I've spoken to over the years, no, it's not a choice to having to have that experience. It's just a factor they find in their life. It is just kind of part of their experience. And the two other things, one would be gender dysphoria at its very extreme level can be very debilitating. For some people, and this would be primarily adults I've spoken to actually, it really is debilitating. It's a kind of each day battling through deep, deep pain and distress. And on the one hand, I want to say we want to not belittle the extent of the pain it can be, but also I think it's helpful to notice gender dysphoria is in a sense quite kind of, I guess the word would be diffuse. It's very hard to describe. It's very hard to pin down. And therefore it is, I think, easy for other things to be mistaken as gender dysphoria. It's kind of such a hard thing to pin down of what is it? How do you describe it? What's it feel like? That it is easy for other things to be put under the banner. And that's also worth bearing in mind as we are engaging young people. We're not saying that this young person is distressed. We're saying there might be reasons to think, is it necessarily really around gender? Because gender dysphoria can be such a kind of a diffuse, broad term. A lot of things could slip under. And if it's not about gender, that's not actually the best way to help a young person. So it's a difficult thing of not downplaying how serious it can be, but also recognizing it can sometimes be hard to pin down and therefore can actually be kind of masking other things.
Could you perhaps go a little further there and give some examples of what could be confused for gender dysphoria?
From the evidence that we're seeing among the cohort of teenagers at the moment, there are all manner of just elements of distress as we've seen, which in a sense can then be, for a young person, explained by this trans narrative. Because very often if you hear young people talk, it's, I always knew there was something slightly different about me. I always knew I didn't quite fit in. And then I heard about trans on YouTube or on Reddit or on TikTok, and suddenly it made sense. This explains it. And it's really appealing because it's explaining. And there seemed to be, from kind of particularly the kind of data we have from kind of the gender clinics around the world, but also now from lots of stories of trans-identified teens, of detransitioners, so people now in their kind of 20s who identified as trans, but now actually have said that wasn't really their issue. And there's a whole host of things. Often there is kind of mental health things at play, depression, OCD, anxiety, things that are rightly distressing, and understandably a young person wants an explanation and an escape route. It seems that ASD, autism spectrum disorder, characteristics and diagnoses are very common. Among the referrals for the under 18 service in the UK, it was something like at least a third of referrals had ASD characteristics, whereas in the general population, it's about 2%, a huge difference. And for young people with ASD, there's a sense of, well, both a sense of things being very binary, and so struggling to maybe cope with the idea of gender non-conformity is kind of different, and the sense of not fitting in, because actually they are conscious that actually they're thinking differently to other people, they're struggling to fit in, and so therefore an explanation for that, or a community in which they feel they can fit in, is really appealing. Others would be things like trauma, which often is kind of someone wanting them to dissociate from who they are, because who they are is where the problem is. Maybe there's been abuse or a traumatic event, and so they want to dissociate from the form of themselves and the experience of themselves that had that traumatic experience, as a way of kind of running away from the pain of that. And one last one would be sexuality. It seems to be very common that before young people identify as trans, they are experiencing same-sex attraction to some extent in some way. And actually, despite what we might expect, although many of your listeners as teachers may know this, being gay is really not cool as a teenager in many contexts, especially if you're a young girl. To be a lesbian in a secondary school is not an easy thing. And so again, actually, if I can transition and be a straight boy rather than a lesbian girl, that becomes quite appealing as a kind of escape thing. So all manner of things can, I think, unhelpfully be brought under the banner of gender when there's other stuff going on.
That's really helpful. And it's really helpful to kind of build up that picture of who might be, and this is not to kind of lump all of these cases together, but who might be more susceptible to these ideas and what may have happened to them in the past, or what other kind of characteristics they have. Do you think there's anything else that is present either in society or even in the school curriculum that has perhaps enabled this to explode in the way it has? And I know obviously you're not a teacher, you're not in schools, but we know that in the media recently there's been uproar about the kind of ideological materials that have often been featured in school curriculum that are focused a lot on identity, the gender-bred man, the gender unicorn. Is this focus on sort of categorization, focus on identifying parts of our perceived kind of identity? Are these things that also feed in, do you think, to this issue?
I think all of those probably are. Yeah. I mean, certainly there does seem to be increasing evidence that very unhelpful materials have been used in school explicitly to talk about gender. It's not even kind of ideas floating around which then feed into it. It's young people explicitly being told stuff which there's no scientific evidence, no logical basis, lots of negative outworkings for individuals and society. But all of that flows from what you mentioned as well, a cultural focus on identity. We identity is such a key thing for us as a culture, and we're very obsessed with knowing who we are, to then to live that out, to find our best life, both of which are really like good concerns. Yeah, when you know who you are and you live that out, you get to experience your best life. Great, it's a good thing that we'll be concerned about. But I think the reason it's such a prominent thing in our culture is because we have no good answers. Because the reality is, once you take away the idea that there is a good creator God who made you and loves you, there is no basis for a solid identity. There's no basis for real meaning and purpose in your life. And so you try different things and none of them delivers. And so you become obsessed with this never-ending quest. You're always trying to catch something that outruns you because you're kind of grabbing the air, as it were. And I think that is true as a culture as a whole. I think that's been projected on young people, and they too are being presented with the same kind of dead ends of how to find their identity, and they don't work. And it's almost like, actually, I always wonder if our adult angst about identity in our secular culture is just being projected on our young people and then becomes really unhelpful to them. I certainly think stereotypes are at play. One of the cultural background to this as well is that through various things, some kind of phony science, through radical feminism, there's been this separation between the body and gender, the kind of body as biological sex and the outworkings of that. Once you do that, if the body doesn't define who you are as a man or woman, there's not much left other than stereotypes. And so we've got to this place where even though we'd say there's a culture, we're rejecting oppressive gender stereotypes, we're actually propagating them because they're the only thing we have for which to define men and women. And again, I think probably these dear children, young people, are receiving basically, and we've got this mess as adult society, and we're now projecting that back onto young people. And so actually, I think probably even more so than when I was at school, stereotypes in culture and probably also school culture, gender stereotypes are much more prominent and they're much more restrictive, kind of narrow boxes. And one other I think people often overlook, we have a cultural sensitivity about and interesting, and this is particularly among our people actually, about minorities and the marginalized. And a lot of that is really, really good. We as a culture, understandably, have guilt about how we have treated people with minority experiences and people who are marginalized in society. And actually, this upcoming generation are keenly aware about justice, fairness, and stuff. And also helping to see that the God of the Bible is the kind of the root for that. But therefore, I think culturally, I wonder if this is particularly prominent young people, there is a risk of being guilty about being part of the dominant group. So it's not even just you're boring if you're cis and straight, it's that actually you're in the oppressive group. And so actually the sense of discomfort young people might feel about being cisgender, i.e. not identifying as trans, about being straight and not experiencing same-sex attraction, I think a lot of young people just feel uncomfortable about that. They're told they're part of the problem in a sense. Yeah. And actually moving to be in a minority position or a marginalized identity gets you out of that sense of, I feel guilty about this. And also for any young person who's looking for a sense of identity or value, it immediately gives you identity or value, because actually to be marginalized or a minority is a strong identity in our culture. And it does give you value because we are trying to react to the wrong things we've done in the past. We are trying to really acknowledge the value of minorities and marginalized groups. And I think that's an overlooked piece of the puzzle, but I think it's probably in the subconscious quite prominent among young people and what's going on.
I think that's an incredibly astute point there. I think, the more I've seen of materials, and I've been doing a lot of reading around these materials for the curriculum recently, and I've become increasingly aware that one of the reasons students might be seeing the sexuality and gender identity movement as a social justice cause is because adults, because teachers and outside agencies are telling them so. And these theories, they promise justice and inclusion. And that's an appealing thing in a world that is often filled with harm and divided by conflict. But I suppose what you're saying and what we believe the Bible's saying is that by leaning into these theories as a solution to problems of sexism or problems of, xenophobia, actually it's also impossible to acknowledge what biblical Christianity teaches about the root cause of some of these issues. And I suppose one of my questions then is, what does the Bible say about gender and sex? Is there good news?
There definitely is. I mean, what does the Bible say? Not a lot. I mean, the Bible isn't obsessed with gender. That's one thing to say. And that's important to say, partly because I think a lot of Christian treatments of gender actually try to go too far, try to say too much. We're actually uncomfortable with how little the Bible says, and therefore we try and expand what the Bible says, but maybe actually end up adding to, and that's where it becomes unhelpful. But actually, when we understand the few basic truths the Bible gives us, it is really wonderful good news, I think, which is this thing of actually, because there is a God who made us, identity, who we are, is dictated by the one who made us, which kind of, we think about this, makes good logical sense. We can kind of get that. We can understand that. So identity is received from God, and that does include our identity as being a man or woman. That's a gift from God to us. It's our creator who determines whether we're a man or woman. He gives us that identity. We receive it. That means we don't discover it within, and we don't create it through some sort of performance. We receive it. The question comes, well, how do you receive it? And I think Genesis 1 is instructive for us there. I think Genesis 1 shows us we receive this identity through our bodies. Because what Genesis 1 does is it says in verse 27, we're created male and female by God, a given identity, just as the image of God in the same verse is given. The very next verse, it says, the very next verse has that command to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth. Why is it that male and female flows immediately into that command? It's because to be male or female, to be man or woman, is to have a body structured to play a certain role in reproduction. It's our bodies to which God speaks to us about who we are as a man or woman. And Genesis 1 shows us that by linking together our creation as male or female with these bodies and the human kind of commission to procreation. And so that means we are given this kind of solid, static identity in our bodies as men and women. And that is really good news for two reasons. One is it actually allows you to define what a man is and what a woman is. And that has lots of individual and societal benefits. One of the problems we have in society at the moment is we have this peculiar situation where people, including politicians, cannot or will not define what a woman is. But then you think, well, how on earth are we going to protect the hard fought for rights of women that have, been fought for over the last 100+ years? A really, really worrying situation. How are we going to protect women and girls? How are we going to just protect sex segregated spaces and rights full stop? There's no way of doing it, because actually the kind of alternative perspective in our culture says that to be a woman is to feel like a woman, which actually doesn't mean anything. What does it mean to feel like a woman? And it's a circular definition. You can't define a word by using a word. What does it mean to be a woman is to feel like a woman? Is to say to be a woman is to feel like someone, is to feel like someone, is to feel like someone. You're stuck in an infinite loop. There's literally no meaning. We have no ability to define what a woman is, what a man is, therefore no ability to protect women's rights or anything else. But actually, if this is about the bodies God gives us, we've got a solid, stable basis on which to make that definition. The other way it's really good is that this means that our identity as a man or woman isn't based on our performance or how we feel, and therefore we don't have to conform to narrow gender stereotypes. I think there are a few little parameters in scripture of how we live this identity out, primarily about our external appearance, so kind of embracing, expressing who God has made us to be. But that doesn't mean we have to live into all these little stereotypes. And so I talk about this wonderful biblical truth, meaning we can know who we are, because God's giving us identity in our bodies that gives us the freedom to be how we are. Doesn't matter actually what your likes and dislikes, your personality and preferences are. They don't shape whether you're a man or woman. Doesn't matter if you're traditionally masculine or feminine. You are already a man or woman because God says you are. So honestly, be relaxed, be how you are. That's fine. And I think that's great news for all people, including young people. Whereas what culture is telling them is, if you're a boy who likes these things and feels this way, you need to check this out. You might not actually be a boy. And so actually this making life complicated, and they're creating doubt and uncertainty for young people. And what you should be saying is, of course you're a boy. God's giving you this wonderful body. That means you're a boy. And the fact that, maybe you're a boy like me who loves musical theatre and Downton Abbey, that doesn't change the fact you're a boy. It doesn't matter. It's wonderful, good news, freeing news. And it's the opposite of what people expect. The Bible is freeing and life-giving. Culture's message actually is really oppressive and causes distress rather than solves it.
Yeah, that's so helpful. And I think so liberating as well, to know that God made us to be who we are as embodied souls. We don't have to deny our sort of, our personalities to be male or female.
Yeah.
He's given us that. And that's a wonderful, liberating thing, isn't it? It doesn't mean that we then have to change a part of our body to fit who we are. So I think then we've kind of touched on the idea of gender ideology and a kind of trend, a cultural trend. And we've touched as well on this very deeply distressing experience of gender dysphoria. Christian teachers escape the polarized perspectives that are often present in social media, and dismissing the legitimacy of a person's experience or even a cultural experience. Can they choose a different way than either affirming or dismissing? How can Christians offer a better story?
Yeah, that's what we want to do, isn't it? We want to find that middle path. I think it maybe starts with what we talked about earlier of, we have to recognize there are two very different things going on in society which are usually enmeshed, but we need to separate our minds. There are people who are distressed and are having difficult, painful experiences. And then there's a certain ideological understanding of that and solution to that. And those two things don't have to go together. If you, in a sense, oppose one or throw out one, you don't have to throw out both. And so it's this thing of, we want to simultaneously recognize there are really unhelpful ideas, claim solutions to this problem, which we need to, for the sake of protecting young people, we need to oppose and speak up against, and actually draw on the good work that's been done to show this isn't good and there's evidence against it, such like, while also not running away from, but in a sense, going to people who are distressed, seeking to understand their experiences, being those who listen well, being those who actually legitimate experience. I'm hearing what you're saying. That must be so painful for you. I'm so sorry. Those kind of things which are saying, your experience is really valid and genuine. Even if we don't think this explanation over here is the best explanation for it. So even just having in our minds, there is more than one battle going on here is really key. It's not just a battle against ideology. It's also a battle to remember there are real people here and to love them well. And I think that's, I think if mine, that's, I guess, why my little booklet's called People, Not Pronouns. The risk is we get caught up in the stuff around ideology, things around pronouns and different stuff. And we just in the process forget there are people tied up in this. And as Christians, we do need to do both and have both in place. And so keeping people at the front of mind. And actually, I think teachers are really well placed to do that. I think one of the best ways to keep people in your mind in a conversation like this is to have contact with real people and hear the real stories. And actually, probably any teacher listening in will know trans-identified people in their school, will know some of their stories, will be interacting with them. That's just a great way. And it's great, actually, we have faces in our mind of when I am even, sometimes needing to firmly debate, say it is with the SLT in my school about a policy around this, I'm simultaneously keeping in my mind the faces of these students who I know are distressed, and we do need to find good ways of caring for them. And it's a hard line to get in the middle, but having those two things and then being able to keep in mind the people side is really important, because for most of us, the risk is getting drawn into the ideological debate and forgetting the people more than vice versa, actually. So knowing they're both there, keeping both in mind is I think the way to begin to find the middle path.
I often get correspondence from members and they bring up issues, and they perhaps often very wisely will kind of challenge leadership or challenge, heads of department. And that sometimes is successful. And because they do it well and with wisdom, they can reach some kind of happy compromise. And other teachers will be less open to the debating around this and will prefer to isolate and will seek to be removed from classes and will not want to have that battle, whether it's to do with teaching things that don't feel are actually statutory requirements, etc. So I suppose when it comes to those teachers, the teachers that I have in mind, perhaps a teacher that has been told there is a child who last week we recognised as female and now is asking to be identified as male. Maybe they've changed their pronouns or their name. How can Christian teachers engage well with these students in the classroom? In your opinion, do you think they should use preferred pronouns, or should they go out of their way to avoid these students seeking to be removed from those classes as a matter of conscience?
I think, as always, Jesus is our good model here. Jesus doesn't ever run away from people that I can see. He's drawn to people, particularly people who are distressed, who are struggling, particularly people whom others might feel uncomfortable with or want to withdraw from. So actually, we should always be the ones being drawn into the situations, even though they feel uncomfortable, but the situations other people might be tempted to withdraw from. And so I think our default for people in general actually wants to be go towards people rather than go away from people. As an example of Jesus, it's so easy for us to be terrified into being stuck because gender comes up. Gender has become, for so many of us, this humongous barrier. And actually, gender is a factor for this student, but in every other way, they're still who they were before you found this out. And in every other way, they're just like every other student you have. And so, yes, you want to be sensitive to that. And yes, there's difficult practical questions like pronouns. But first, I'm going to say, don't be freaked out by gender. Don't be scared off. Don't think that you are not already well equipped for this. You're a teacher, you're a trained teacher, you're a Christian who loves Jesus. You're already really well equipped to love this young person well and serve them well. And all your normal good common sense about being a good teacher for that person, don't kind of switch it off. So treat them as an individual, treat them as you would any other people. Try and make sure they feel noticed and they feel valued, that they feel you're a safe person they can talk to, all those kinds of things. On the really practical things like pronouns, I mean, this is so complicated and complicated on its own, further complicated by the reality of schools will have policies and stuff like this often. I think for us as Christians, I do actually think it's primarily an individual conscience thing. I don't think it's something Scripture doesn't speak explicitly about, of course. I don't think there's even clear principle guidance in Scripture. Therefore, I would see this as what Scripture would call a disputable matter, the kind of thing Paul the Apostle talks about in Romans 14:15, which means we reach a conclusion in conscience before God. We wrestle with it in prayer and thinking where we feel comfortable with in conscience before God. And then we seek to live that out, but that we as Christians respect the fact that there can be disagreements here. And we seek unity as Christians, even with those disagreements there. That's kind of a baseline point, I would say. So I think it is important for every teacher in this context to think, okay, what do I believe before God is the right thing here? What do I, as I wrestle with the scriptures and my conscience, what I do? But then also I want to come at the pragmatic point of it is fairly easy to avoid using pronouns.
Yeah.
And that often, just in a sense, to avoid controversy in either direction, if you are or aren't using pronouns, it's often just easier to do that. We're so lucky for an English-speaking school. We do not need to use gendered pronouns when talking to someone. I mean, I guess if you're a French teacher or something, if you've got gendered second-person pronouns, which they made you may have an issue. If the word "you" is gendered in the language you're teaching, it may be slightly more complicated, actually. Most of us have the freedom actually to avoid that. And the other thing I always want to say with teachers on pronouns, I don't think that any teacher should be using pronouns to try and make a point or teach a lesson to children. By all means, there might be robust debates to be had of SLT. I do not think it's at all acceptable for a teacher to deliberately use a pronoun a young person doesn't want them to use because they're trying to make some message or make some point, because that is not going to achieve anything other than making that young person think that you hate them and you're horrible. And if they know you're a Christian, then you are being a really bad witness for Jesus there. So I feel quite strongly that that's not our role in a sense. And this links the whole thing of our role is not really actually to defend God's truth. God doesn't need us to defend him. He's going to do that okay. His truth is okay. Our role is to look for the well-being or work for the well-being of people, especially vulnerable people such as young people and distressed people. And so that should be our motivation, not trying to win arguments, not actually even trying in a sense to defend God, as it were, but to work for the well-being of vulnerable people should be motivating what we're doing in a context like this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's again something that's real food for thought. And I think there'll be lots of our members who will have quite strong convictions on whether pronouns or referring to different names should be something that they take on or not. I think it's really helpful when you say, I'd already been thinking this, that third person pronouns really aren't something that crops up very often. So we can be wise and savvy about the way that we kind of respond to these requests. I don't think it's necessarily black or white. However, at some point, there could be a situation where Christian teachers do need to draw the line and they are asked to make a decision. But is there any good news that we can give thanks for? I know that recently, in fact, I think it was this week, there was some further guidance from the NHS, the final interim specifications for treating gender dysphoric youth. Could you give me a little bit more information about that might make Christians a bit more confident about challenging this idea that we have to affirm in all situations?
Yeah, there really is good news. I mean, globally, there is a significant challenge to that idea that affirmation is always the right thing, the most helpful thing for young people. We're seeing in several nations, and actually England has been one of the kind of leaders in that. So at the moment, there's actually called the Cass Review, a review led by a paediatrician called Hilary Cass of GIDS, the Gender Identity Development Service for Under 18s NHS, which has released an interim report and will release a final report later this year, on the basis of which significant changes are being made to the NHS provision for under 18s, which is what, the specification is talked about. It's how the new service is going to work. And basically what the Cass Review has shown is what people have been saying for years, actually coming out of GIDS. Actually, young people are very quickly being fast-tracked to various forms of intervention, including hormonal or medical intervention, that there isn't actually good evidence that is safe or helpful, and that there did seem to be all these things among these young people, things we've talked about, mental health, ASD characteristics, sexuality, trauma, which just weren't being addressed. And what actually the new specification of the NHS says, which is the new service we're running from later this year, is it's almost a complete turn actually of where things have gone from. Whereas the practice, even not the specification thus far, has been you basically go what the young person says, you basically move them fairly quickly to different forms of transition. This basically says, no, we need to slow down and realize there's loads of things going on with these young people and take a holistic view. We need to explore all those different facets of life that could be at play and just what is going on in life for them, and not be blinded by gender. And importantly, it also is saying, as the Cass Review said, and now the specification is saying, that even social transition, so even names and pronouns and such like, is a significant intervention. I think they call it a psychosocial intervention or something. It does something, basically. It does, we know, make it less likely that these feelings will naturally go away for a young person, which is still the most common outcome anyway, if there isn't intervention. And so actually, we as adults may well be harming young people, even by allowing social transition, because it's affirming them and make it less likely that they're going to naturally come out of a situation. And if they stay in that situation, they might well go on to medical social treatments that have all manner of complications and side effects. The good news is basically we are moving to a position where we are going to treat these young people as holistic young people, which they are. There should be much better thinking, actually, how do we handle this experience better for them and not be blindsided by gender. I think for teachers and others working on people, it's really helpful because it gives some backing to what for many of us would be an instinctive sense of, I'm just not sure it's helpful for this teenager to be changing their pronouns and saying they're someone different from who their body says and such like. And the hope would be that when the long promised new guidance for schools comes out, which, apparently should be any day, as we know, or any week now, that should presumably be based on this, which I'm really hoping and praying will be really good actually for the safeguarding of young people, for the better treating of these young people who are distressed and have genuine stuff going on, and should be a similar thing of let's be really slow at encouraging transition, but really quick at saying, we care about you as a person. What's going on? Let's explore this. How can we support you? How can other agencies around you support you? And so hopefully that will give a lot of backing. I think a great thing for Christian teachers to do at that point will be to make sure SLT know about this and know about the new guidance and all that follows this stuff. Actually, it's great about showing as Christians, we really care about our pupils. And this is about caring for our pupils. Let's make sure we're good at this as a school.
Yeah, I think absolutely spot on there. Yeah, I'm just so thankful for your time, Andrew, today. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you with us. I think my last question would be, and this kind of brings you back to your own experience. Is there anything teachers could have done to support you better when you were a young person at school wrestling with some of these ideas?
I think a lot of it comes down to all the things that no doubt all your listeners as teachers want to be, and what makes a good teacher is, yes, all the great teaching, the education side, but being a person who genuinely cares about young people, who has time for young people, who as the young people know, actually, this is someone who does care about me as a person, who is interested in me. Therefore, they are someone who's going to listen if there's stuff going on. And I wonder if for lots of young people, if they don't have that. And actually, you hear that in trans narrative stories of young people who identify as trans, fall into the online trans world and say, finally, I've got a place where people listen to me. Finally, I've got a place where I can ask my big questions. I can be honest about what's going on in my life. And what's actually most heartbreaking about hearing those stories, thinking, wow, you had to just go into a random online chat room with complete strangers to find that. Think, gosh, actually, all sorts of contexts, including church and youth group, and actually schools and Christian teachers, we should be the ones where a young person is just finding life difficult. They know we're a person they can talk to. When they've got big questions, they know we're someone they can talk to. So I think it's as simple as being a teacher that values students, has maybe a literal open door, but the metaphorical open door, at least, actually, of being someone that students can talk to. And then that important thing of when students do talk to us, being good listeners. And again, this thing, actually, we want to legitimate the experience. As good, reflective listeners of, wow, I'm hearing you're saying this. So how does that make you feel? I'm so sorry it's been the case. That must have been really difficult. These things. So a young person goes away thinking, that teacher really listened to me, seems to really care about me. They may or may not actually say anything about what they think about this, but I feel like I've been pretty well cared for. And I think basically that should be our aim. Surely in all sorts of circumstances, including gender questioning, is a way teachers can love and support students well.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew. And we'll be praying for you in your incredibly valuable ministry, working for the Lord, living out, and also at your church in pastoral ministry as well. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been great to be here.